I do not care for Genesys. I was perfectly fine leaving it at just that initially. If I don't care that much about the format in general, I don't think I really have anything to say about it. However, the devil on my shoulder has other plans, because every time I've seen criticism of the format, it's surface level and not all that insightful. You either have people that hate the format and don't engage with it in any way, or the people that don't care for it but can't really meaningfully articulate a reason as to why that's the case. So someone's gotta do it. I wanted to like Genesys. When it was announced, I was actually excited. The point system sounded interesting. Then after a day passed, I lost all interest. And that's because after trying to experiment within the new parameters, I realized it didn't really meaningfully do anything to change deck building philosophy as a whole. This sentiment has been boiled down by most people as it's modern light. This assessment is entirely reductive. It doesn't actually point towards the reason that Genesys currently feels underwhelming as a new format to some people. The reason I bring this up is because one of the core tenets behind Genesys itself. Most people cling to the yesterday's gameplay, today's cards quote, which is odd to me because this quote isn't associated with the core goals of the format, it's a tagline on their site. The place you ironically won't even find the format by looking at. What does strike a nerve is their actual MO. There is none, which has led to everybody proclaiming what the format actually is, according to them. So it's best to look at what Genesys is, based on what Konami themselves have presented. They outlined who the format is for, and it basically amounts to, I don't know, anyone I guess. The only concrete philosophy to glean from it is that it's meant to be less complicated, which translates to we've cut out links and pendulums. That does make the game less complicated vertically. You went from here to here. There's the claim of making your favorite deck more competitive, which automatically isn't true if your favorite deck includes pendulums or links. God help you if you like a weaker deck that needed both. Already, there's a clear discrepancy in the format's goals. The real main takeaway is the deck building challenge provided by the point system over a ban list, with this set to introduce a new gameplay experience. This is not at all what people interrogate when talking about the format. Instead, it's a tagline from a site no one's ever visited in their life. It's tangential to the claim of making your favorite deck more competitive, but it's not actually related. Besides, the claim's immediately dispelled by the format's own rules removing cards from the game entirely. The problem is that the format's goals are so loosely defined that people are just tossing out interpretations, critiquing the format in a direction that doesn't actually go anywhere, not acknowledging the fact that the philosophy of the format itself needs to be better communicated and defined to begin with. This way both the players and the team behind the format can better understand how to adjust it. The core feature of Genesys is the point system, so we have to extrapolate reason from that alone. In their second blog post on Genesys, they outlined their reason for using a point system, citing that no independent card is so broken that it can't be allowed to play at all, acknowledging that it's these cards in conjunction with other cards that cause the real problems in gameplay balance. So the point system allows a way for these sorts of cards to be legal for play, but sets them up in such a way that they can't lead to undesirable gameplay. Yeah, so that's just an outright lie. Some cards shouldn't exist. And that's why they're pointed at 100, with every card that could possibly make them tick pointed to at least 1 point. This is fine by me. It's not like I want these godless abominations played to begin with. Where I take issue is with the instances that clearly embrace this philosophy they're referring to. They have a post outlining all these cool things you can do in Genesys that you can't do in the core game, being able to play so many different cards banned in the traditional game. I occasionally get the itch to build a deck around these sorts of cards in Genesys, but most of the time, once I start putting together a list around them, I immediately become disinterested again. Because the reality is one of two things. The card is pointed so high, it can only be a one of, meaning you can't actually play a deck around it unless it's searchable, which it likely isn't, making it sacky at best. Or, alternatively, the card is too high as a playset, so it's still just sacky for the sake of it. When your budget is better spent on necessities like staples and engine, there's no reason to ever build this way, because even if you build that way for fun, you're not gonna have fun. You'll be sitting through 99% of games where your deck doesn't do the thing you want it to. The only Genesys deck concept I've made that felt like it embodies this intended philosophy of Genesys is with Unchained, an archetype that likes having its own cards blown up, both monsters and spell traps. This means you can max out on both Dark Hole and Heavy Storm. Since they aren't too high cost, you still have a flexible budget to afford necessary staples, but they're high enough that most decks wouldn't want to use their budget space on them, making it so only this deck gets to make use of that, something that can't really be achieved in the normal game. You can even play other cards that benefit from being popped or put in grave in general, but that's where more cracks began to show, because there aren't many generically useful spell traps that meet that criteria to begin with. However, that's the least of the logistical issues. Unfortunately, Unchained is a link deck, in a format that's removed links entirely. So at best, you end up playing it as a janky control strategy, which is outclassed by any other control strategy that actually has its key pieces. Because having access to Dark Hole and Heavy Storm doesn't make up for the fact that deck's playstyle is basically gutted. While I feel this is a good example of why I see the format's promises currently unfulfilled, there's a more monolithic example of this dissatisfaction, one that highlights the biggest struggle with the point system itself. This being what I've deemed the Crimson Quandary. They clearly want you to play Crimson Dragon in some capacity. They moved it from 100 to 80, because the reality is, who even wants these three stooges to be free? The Crimson Dragon is an iconic part of 5Ds. As a card, it lets you summon out any Synchro Dragon equal to another Synchro's level on field. This design is less healthy in the main game because it would barf out cards that provided undesirable gameplay when summoned so easily. Blazar and Cipher negate. Calamity just stops your opponent from playing the game. But since the point system exists, it can prevent these interactions from occurring while not outright banning any of the cards, allowing you to play it and use it for far more healthy gameplay. Despite that fact, no one's bothering to play it, not because it doesn't do anything unless it summons these toxic cards, it's because it's still too overpriced to play even with the adjustment, as evidenced by the fact they left other similar offenders entirely unpointed. There is no Synchro deck in the game that can make both Crimson and another Synchro consistently, while also not being pointed out of playing it in the first place. There's no deck to possibly play it in within the format. You can't play it in Centurion, a deck notorious for using Crimson Dragon. They've pointed the Centurion cards, making it impossible to run playsets of the main deck alongside it. You could cut copies, sacrificing consistency, but importantly, the corner piece Synchro of the deck is pointed to prevent that either, making it entirely impossible to play the deck with Crimson Dragon. This could have been an opportunity to use it for more healthy gameplay in the context of Genesys, but the point system doesn't actually accomplish that. You can't play it in Blue Eyes because their most important card is heavily pointed. The annoying part of Blue Eyes using Crimson was that you could cheat it out with a Spirit Dragon, a card that wasn't once per turn, nor difficult to summon multiple of, to then cheat out a negate in archetype and one out of archetype. But those Blue Eyes cards are unpointed, so it's not like I want Crimson to be played with Blue Eyes in Genesys. You can't play Crimson with Yusei or Jack's decks either because Yusei's best means of doing so is 100 points, and Jack's best Synchro to climb into eats up the rest of the budget. Crimson is always pointed out of being playable, not just with the gameplay offenders, but the core engines of the decks that can make it to begin with. The list goes on and on. Crimson Dragon isn't playable in any capacity within Genesys, even though in Genesys it's a card that should encapsulate the idea of making the unbalanced balanced. But even if it were playable in all these decks with no point conflicts presented by the engine, there's still no reason to play it, because you can't budget staples, which means the deck can't work in a competitive setting by design. So even then, you realize there's no point in going through all this effort for the card, because the only genuine use Crimson has is as a gimmick, summoning a card like Supreme King Clearwing, a card you can't physically summon in the format because pendulums don't exist. They can lower Crimson Dragon's point cost, but that also means increasing the point cost of the associated troublemaking combo enablers. And while I don't necessarily care for the gameplay these three stooges offer, this philosophical quandary isn't exclusive to them. As mentioned, there are other cards that provide a similar gameplay experience they don't want, meaning they'd need to be pointed as well, yet they've been unpointed, implying they don't want the point balance resting on these cards, meaning there's much more weight behind letting the card be played in general. While limiting all these cards specifically might be inoffensive to most, there are other point balance dilemmas with far murkier waters. This instance just made me acutely aware of that fact. Every problem combo becomes a tug of war for pointing. You have to make sure they can't possibly be played together, but you also have to make them low enough that you can play them in a real deck without the other. But you just can't win, because you can't really make them both affordable cards. One has to pay for the sins of the other one way or the other, despite the framing of the format wanting to erase those sins. So I want to delve further into this Crimson Quandary as a whole, looking into other cards that clearly have this intent, but highlight a clear issue with the point system's current application, because I feel as though it's the true culprit of why Genesys feels underwhelming in its premise, so we have to look at what budgeting actually translates to. As I've mentioned, cards that are pointed at 100 are functionally banned. You can't play them with any other pointed card, and that's something that isn't worth the time to play. But other price margins might as well serve the same purpose. There aren't many other defined roles for point applications. Cards that have a value of 60 or higher might as well be considered banned as well. Genesys inherits the standard game's card pool, so naturally everything from its gameplay ecology is also inherited. It's then the job of the points to modify that ecology into a different experience. But it doesn't really put much effort into doing so. Because it's modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, hand traps are necessary in the game's ecosystem to maintain a sense of balance. They've pointed them so you can't run all of them for free, notably more harshly pointing the usual suspects, with most of the lower impact and unconventional ones at a low enough value that you can play a couple in full playsets. Importantly, making Ash, the most ubiquitous modern hand trap, too expensive to see widespread use. This is all a great balancing idea on paper. However, this creates an issue with the idea of the point system as a unique budget. Decks are designed to allow a budget of 100 points. The inherited necessity for hand traps essentially translates to the budget actually being something more close to 60-ish. But you also have to consider engine and other staples. Most engines and staples are pointed to limit their power and use, since that's one of the format's other goals. Usually, said engines and staples are designed to eat up a majority of the budget for that reason, but this makes it so the actual budget is more so 30 or less, meaning you can't play many of the cards unique to the format. The promise of 100 points feels misleading as a result, since you don't actually have the freedom to spend it in unique ways. You spend it on the necessities. There's not really room to play anything else pointed in the double digits. It only serves to arbitrarily lessen Modern's power level, not warp it. It's why it feels like Modern Light, because it's lessening some aspects of Modern, but not to the point of creating a truly different experience. Not really providing a distinctly unique feel for deck building and gameplay like the format wants to. This wouldn't be such a big deal if there were competent decks that could balance the hand trap budget, or could utterly forgo them, had negligible engine costs, all while providing a healthy gameplay experience using a heavily pointed card, but such a deck doesn't really exist. The prices on these higher end cards makes them unplayable, despite the clear desire to see you use some of them for more interesting and fair gameplay. They might as well be banned, and not all of them feel like they warrant that treatment. Scientist, fittingly, is another card that raises the Crimson Quandary. He's a card that's notoriously broken in the standard game, but with the balance of the point system, what he does can be reined into something far more healthy and unique. But he's at 95 points, making it so he's only at 1 and not worth playing in any capacity. What's the point of hyping up these banned cards under a new light if they aren't actually playable under a new light? I'd love to use Scientist to summon out fusions for more reasonable goals, no longer limiting his use to dumb combo FTKs. Links being removed gets a massive hurdle out of the way for his use in a modern context, and the point system's entirely capable of dialing out everything else you don't want, but it comes at the cost of evaluating what's the perfect value for Scientist to limit numerous undesirable interactions, while also not making cards that are only a problem with him too expensive. One of the scary prospects with Scientist is that he's a one card rank 1 through 6. Multiple if you're willing to use up half or more of your extra just as material, with a card like Ripper being an immediate point of concern in that regard. But Canine as a whole is heavily pointed. You can easily point him out of these undesirable combos without making him 95 points. But at a point you start to wonder if this is sustainable. The new Fairy Tail cards are coming along not too far off. Do we want to see Scientist be playable just to facilitate that in Genesys? There's also Scientist's interaction with Dinomorphia, both facilitating their life point gimmick and cheating out bodies. In these cases, it's harder to definitively set a point value that keeps these combos from getting out of hand, while allowing you to play 3 Scientists for more reasonable gameplay. Despite how fun it may sound to make these broken cards balanced, it seems like there's not nearly as much effort put into figuring out a way to do so, because it's so hard. However, there's the much easier counter question in making Scientists cheaper. Why is 1 for 1 91 points? Scientist is literally the most threatening thing that could be summoned off of it, but they've put him at 95. There are certainly strong ones you can summon off of it, but once again, the point system exists for a reason. It can apply costs steep enough to box that out and make it only desirable to play for the reasonable applications. But it's not being applied to this card either. A card that arguably would make a healthier impact on the format if it was one of the cheaper cards. Dragonar is another card in this category of philosophy. It's a card that's typically used to barf out negates and Photon Lord and Hope Harbinger. They pointed them so you still can play one of them alongside it, but it's basically your whole budget. The only combo entirely prevented is with Numeron Dragon. Dragonar functions pretty similar to Crimson, being able to summon out just about any number, reflecting the toolbox nature of them. The problem is, there were negates that limited it actually being a toolbox. So, like Crimson Dragon, it's kinda just been left to rot. Outside of the high-end soft band values, you have the cards that are in the 20 to 50 point margin. For some cards, this basically functions as a limited or semi-limited list, both in the traditional sense as well as in the Duel Link sense, making it so you can only afford to budget a copy or two of said card, either in conjunction with another powerful card the deck intends to use, or purely to limit how many copies of a card you're willing to run. Then there are those that are more so caught in the middle. They're pointed low enough that you still have a reasonable budget for necessities, but you can't play them with cards that actually make them play unique to the format, even card combos that aren't necessarily degenerate, like Crimson with Auxilla and Isolation. 50 points itself has its specific roles that are more questionable. Tyr is unplayable as an actual archetype. Just about every name is 50 points. You can't play Tyr, but you can play some dumb mill strategy with a Tyr card. Instead of lowering its power level, or more pressingly, finding ways to tweak its playstyle for the format, it's just a niche gimmick. It's technically changing how you play them, but by not making you able to play them. It's pigeonholed, not modified. The need to point cards in conjunction with them makes it a choice of who to kill. You can't heavily tax all the staple fusions because they're not really broken in most other decks to warrant it, and you can't also make Tyr's engine cheap with them being practically free. But the most prevalent point of conflict is in that of cards that mill. Zombie, Vampire, Chaos Ruler, Grass, Monster Gate, Reasoning, along with the Ishizu millers. These cards are all pointed to 50. This makes it so you can't play them with Tyr. This way you could hypothetically play one of them within a unique deck that can utilize them, since there's enough wiggle room for a standard budget. But this then makes it so Tyr has to have points that directly contrast with these millers, which puts us in the situation where just about every Tyr name is a 50-point card. Personally, I'm not a fan of Tyr, but I find it pretty disheartening to see an entire deck that's years old at this point functionally banned. And more concerningly, the cards that have negate printed on them, the ones that provide a gameplay loop they don't want overly present, aren't the ones that are pointed, showing they're more concerned the deck is played at all and not concerned with making the deck's play patterns more reserved to meet the standards of Genesys. Other applications of the 50 split actually serve to better prevent you from using broken combos. Monarch can play one Domain or one Erupt, and True Draco can't swipe Erupt either because Diagram and Masterpiece are sizably pointed. This leaves you an actual budget, but only allows you to play one of these. The problem is, these lean more into preserving a toxic side of gameplay anyways, and this is one of the only useful applications of this 50 split balancing philosophy. It also just made people play extra deck Monarch, and it turns out Monarch's still a frustrating strategy when you print cards like these and point nothing else in the engine, making it so the deck's goal is to just rip your opponent's extra deck and hand away to stomp them with Monarch's plenty competent unpointed engine. It's pretty disheartening to see the only instance of a card pointed this high being played is literally because it's unhealthy game balance. Then you have the opposite side of the spectrum for 50-50. Both Sangen Summoning and Dreadful Dolls are 100 points. These are field spells that produce a similar unhealthy gameplay loop around their associated archetypes, so cutting them out of the strategy makes sense. And unfortunately for Gimmick Puppet, it's also their most crucial search spell. But even without them, these decks have other unhealthy gameplay patterns, and both decks get the 50-50 treatment. However, these feel as though they miss the point. Gimmick Puppet has strings and the associated rank up at 50. This prevents you from playing it as a consistent FTK enabler, since it would cost the full budget, while every rank up is pointed at 1, so it's impossible to do that to begin with. This serves to remove all the unhealthy elements of their design without gutting the deck entirely in the process. On paper. But without dolls, the deck is far less consistent in general, so they could have just opted to fully cut out the FDKs, pointing them heavily alongside fanatics to make it impossible to use them for FDKs, then make dolls a moderately pointed card. Since the toxic thing that it was protecting is no longer present in play, the card becomes far less frustrating. Having it with a decent cost means the deck can play it, but at the price of including more staples and necessities. With Tenpai, the approach was to put Chandra and Kaiman at 50, with Genroku thrown at 25 points. I should clarify, all of these decks I personally don't have a vested interest in. I'm not going to act like I want to see constructed Tenpai played, but this is another approach to pointing that seems to go in the wrong direction, just gutting the deck instead of balancing them out. Tenpai needs Chandra and Genroku because they're the only fours to give Biden access. So you can't play Kaiman, which is a consistency hit, and you can't play a Genroku playset because a playable deck can't afford that in budget. This idiot was the other big problem card of the deck's design, and it isn't pointed. It's like Mega Zaborg, where the playability of poor gameplay is at best limited rather than disallowed to begin with. Tenpai could have been posed to make the original Dragon in this format. They could have pointed out Pydra as a subtle way to balance the deck, since you now have to take all the damage from ramming your dragons into monsters. They could point Biden to make the deck synchro other dragons and play a more reserved game, but no. It's a controversial modern deck. So instead of trying to find a way to uniquely balance it within the confines of Genesys, we've just cut out the middleman and killed it on the spot. The 51 point value performs a relatively similar role to the 51 as you'd expect. Of course, entirely preventing you from playing multiples, and in conjunction with other high-pointed cards, mostly to box out stupid FDKs. But I take issue with two of the Mitsurugi cards being here. Habikiri is 100 points. It's absolutely the biggest offender for the deck being too generic as an engine, with almost every ritual consistency card pointed to an extent to make sure it never shows up. Despite that, both Prayers and Ritual are 51 points. Prayers I can understand. It's another card that gives you access to the archetype for little cost if you see it. But Ritual is crucial to how the archetype functions, so you either pick the deck's entire functionality or the singular free engine piece. You can't build around just using Ritual, which would encourage you to play Mitsurugi in a more pure manner, something that's infinitely healthier in gameplay. If you're afraid of Ritual still making them a generic engine, you could put it at 11 apiece. And if it were still to become an engine, there's other cards that should be pointed. The other offenders as to why Mitsurugi is abused generically is the Omni-Negate Trap paired with a Quick Effect Raigeki that's also a Hand Ripper and a Gate. If these cards are pointed, who cares if Mitsu's an engine? If other decks don't have the budget for the parts that make the engine provide something, no decks will want to play them but pure Mitsurugi. It feels like a deck that's subject to the mentality of keeping a modern deck out of Genesys entirely, when they should be more focused on warping how it plays in the context of the format. Speaking of, while we're talking about a tribute-based archetype, let's talk about Metamorphosis. Metamorphosis is a card that's banned in the TCG. It tributes a monster to summon out a fusion monster with the same level. It's a card that provides a chance to spotlight the intended selling point of Genesys. However, it ironically highlighted how inoffensive of a card it is nowadays, because it turns out, when you cut the auto-win targets out, it's not worth it to rely on a card you have to draw. You could play it with Mitsu, which is a cool design synergy on paper, triggering their tribute effects to summon out a fusion, using the level 4 Mitsus to summon out the new upcoming Fairy Tail fusions, allowing you to bridge into Fairy Tail, or tribute the rituals to summon out something powerful like Luce. But not only is that less interesting in practice because of Mitsu's general design, not actually mattering since the tribute means they're on field, i.e. the effect's already been used, but Metamorphosis is 5 points. Inexpensive in the grand scheme of things, but not in the context of Mitsu, making it so Mitsu wouldn't even consider playing it since half the budget is spent on either Prayers or Ritual. This is the problem with Genesys as a distinct format. These cards that have an opportunity to shine in a new and more desirable light in Genesys just can't, either because the budget's too tight to include them, or the cards aren't good enough in the few decks that could theoretically best use them. It's only once we get toward the lower end that cards are more reasonable to consider playing. The 20 and under point values are typically more akin to taxes, limiting the accessibility of staples and engines. with the bottom end mostly serving to lock out FTKs, with the rank up spells being 1 point to prevent them being used alongside problematic pointed Xyzs, and generic draw spells around or under 10 to prevent deep draw FTKs, which is a great segue to talk about the Pot of Greed dilemma. This is likely what they wanted to sell Genesys on. The fact you can play 3 Pot of Greed, or even 2 Graceful Charity is an enticing sell for a format, until you read the fine print. You could play a playset of Pot, but you'll be playing a crappy deck. And sure, you could fittingly be less greedy and play only 2 copies, but that's still a large chunk of the budget for that. Every archetype that's remotely strong has a budget that conflicts with it regardless. It's just not worth it to build a deck with Pot of Greed, because there's no deck in the game where playing Pot of Greed gives you a legitimate edge. They mention the idea that everyone has their price, that they'll actually consider lowering Pot's point cost. But that's the problem. It's difficult to find a sweet spot for it. If you make it too cheap, everyone's gonna play the damn thing. Not unless engines become further harshly pointed as a result, which in turn means you can't do other interesting things or have other important staples. But if Pot of Greed is too steep, no one in their right mind is going to waste budget space on it. Ultimately, despite how iconic Pot of Greed is, it's not worth being the face of this dynamic in points, because it's a universally good card, with Graceful being even more dangerous. The real selling points should be these traditionally banned cards that are far more interesting when they can't be played with unhealthy cards, when their design actually leans into engaging synergies that are fun to interact with. This Pot of Greed dilemma also leads me into another conflict though. The more straightforward consistency tools in the game are pointed severely. Between Pot and Graceful's point values, funnily enough, there are a lot of weak warrior decks that would love to play Rhoda at 3, with the added consistency being a genuine boost, but the current point value makes it so you wouldn't. Hell, you'd rather just play 3 Pot of Greed. The decks that could really use that boost can't, and the decks that already would play one don't bother, because they're still much better and would rather spend the budget on necessities. This is one of the format's bigger letdowns in my eyes. These generic search spells could be pointed more closely to something around 10. 30 points is negligible to the sorts of decks that get a massive boost out of 3. Decks like Dual Avatar or Argo Stars can play 3 Rhoda and still include staples, but something like Vanquish Soul wouldn't bother because the engine itself is already eating up the budget. And the same could be said for more powerful warrior-centric decks. This goes for any one of these generic search spells, because realistically, them being lower makes them more of a buff for the pet deck crowd, the thing they supposedly want to push with Genesys. Most archetypal consistency cards are at this 30+ price point, and it actually helps to set these decks back pretty well. So the weaker decks suddenly getting better consistency is going to help them. Of course, consistency doesn't change the fact that most of these decks are weak in general, but it certainly means you can play them to begin with. Finding the perfect way to actually give the older decks a unique leg up should be a goal that they look into for Genesys. Even then, not all searchers are created equal, yet they were treated like it initially. Incoming Machine was 33 points. No one played it. They made it free, and no one's playing it still. Pointing consistency is only relevant when it applies to strategies that are already consistently powerful. Then you have the opposite issue, the consistency cards that aren't pointed because they go minus technically. The obvious egregious card being 7th Tachyon. Tachyon does limit you to playing Xyz, but it really is one of the most generic searchers in the game. It should have some points to its name. The only search spell that makes you go minus that I understand not being pointed is Signet Mining, and that's because this entire monster type does nothing without links. What matters is identifying what search spells should and shouldn't be heavily pointed, because some of them are too free for being too good, or too harshly pointed, despite being something that would be fine at a lower point cost. There needs to be more effort put into viewing how these cards interact with the old as well as the new, boxing out the undesirable just as much as letting in the desirable. That way, the old's gameplay experience can feel new as well. That's one of the core reasons Genesys is posed as being modern light. But there's another big reason as to why that feels like it's the case. The reason it feels like modern is because the point system's existing dynamic doesn't actually provide a different gameplay experience. People act like there's a magical way to conjure an entirely new gameplay experience with the existing card pool, then never actually talk about balancing changes to accomplish that. If Genesys's point system actually achieved its goals, this wouldn't be an issue. They have to address Modern's design philosophy on a broader scale with points. Currently, it seems like only hand traps had that attention to detail. If hand traps are free, you have the problem Modern has where you can just play a massive swath of them to shut out combos. If hand traps cost too much, they can't be played to stop absurd combos, so the point system has to actually lower the power limit of said combos. The absence of links limited this issue numerically, but not fundamentally. It didn't erase it as a whole since it's ingrained in modern design in general. Points need to be more harsh with absurd combo pieces that are unhealthy, making it so hand traps aren't a necessity, just relevant tools to consider playing, limiting cards whose power level demands hand traps be played. They pointed out doo-doo shitter, and that helped balance immensely. The game's ecosystem has to be one that doesn't force you to play hand traps. There can't be cards that dictate you stop them or you lose on the spot, because if they are a necessity, it's impossible to achieve the philosophy of the format, because you'll always have to forfeit a sizable portion of your budget just to accommodate this gameplay problem. Limiting combo doesn't resolve everything though, because after all, the problem is typically what the combos produce. Doo-doo shitter was being used to make Rongo, who was 31 points to prevent use with Gossip Shadow, and I really don't think the point distribution should have been this way. Gossip is far less egregious in design in general. I don't know why they didn't just make Rongo 100 points to begin with. Points should aim to make endboards healthier in general, not just hit existing strong decks for the sake of it. Like I highlighted earlier, there are archetypes that are harshly pointed, but the parts of them that actually produce undesirable play aren't. It shows a lack of priority in applying the format's philosophy. Droll was a quote-unquote necessary evil that people absolutely hated, and cited as ruining the format. They pointed it out as being generically playable, and hit cards that were demanding it to be a necessary evil. There is a way to balance things wholly, it's just a matter of taking action to ensure that's the case, because ultimately doing so will provide a better experience for everyone. There are still cards that invoke an imbalance that Droll would counter, but it's just a matter of hitting those cards as well, because making the game's overall health better is what matters. The biggest step to curbing the power of endboards is in further pointing negation effects, especially Omni negates. There are already ones they have pointed, but there are seemingly just as many that have been overlooked for some reason. As I mentioned with Tyr and Vitsu, these weren't the elements of their design that was pointed, when they're the most frustrating part of their design. Negates are purely reductive interaction in gameplay. When there are far too many of them present, gameplay quality degrades immensely. If all these sorts of cards have a steep price, it prevents decks from ever becoming a pile of negates, something that Cool Tune is currently struggling with in design balance. Between all the hand trap negates and its own unpointed boss monster, it's actively enabling this poor gameplay loop and on a top level. Points can be applied so we still have the capacity to use them as a blanket solution to gameplay, but make it so we'll never be in a scenario where the game devolves into how many negates you can drop in a turn. And like in what I mentioned with Mitsurugi, cutting their worth as a splashable engine, preventing abuse, while still encouraging genuine play of the deck itself. Other than gameplay balance, we have the other reason why people call it Modern Light: the presence of modern decks. People were mad Vanquish Soul was playable in the format on release. The problem was that Vanquish Soul K9 was playable in the format on release, a deck that was already absurdly powerful within the modern format, making this desire to lower the power level seem entirely irrelevant. They more harshly pointed K9 and pointed Vanquish Soul to force them apart. Since they wanted to make the format a lower power level, this is perfectly fine. It's what the format should be doing. But Vanquish Soul is still playable in the format, and you still see some people complain, even if it's being played with Genesys, the most apt change to occur with this format, with the deck being more limited in power. But because it's a modern deck, it's a problem. It isn't. The only problem Vanquish Soul presented was in Holisu being a turn 0 card in a format that intends to lower the bar for power. So all of the new turn 0 cards are pointed pretty high to limit their play in the game's ecosystem. They become a heavy engine tax you can't play many of. The only real struggle currently is finding a way to limit the power of modern powerhouses for the format. Draco Tail is a deck that refuses to fall off in the format no matter how they point it. Despite that fact, I think the notion of killing the deck entirely is antithetical to the concept of the format. format. The desired power level and gameplay has to be better defined, and doing so with modern decks is the best way to set an example. Lowering the ceiling, not caving it in. The other cynical concern people have with Genesys is with archetypes that didn't crack it in competitive Modern. Radiant Typhoon is a recent deck that never cracked it in Modern, on release, and it wasn't initially pointed in Genesys for that reason, making it appealing to play with since other existing Modern decks typically are pointed. They've stated and shown a willingness to point these decks later because they're sort of just unknowns. They didn't really perform well in Constructed, so there's not a set expectation of how that translates to Genesys. But now people want even these decks pointed on release. Cool Tune released recently and didn't perform so well in Modern, but it's a decently strong deck in Genesys. Somehow this is interpreted as a gotcha, even though Genesys is a Western exclusive initiative. It's not like they designed these cards for this format. In reality, it's just the deck clearly wasn't finished, like every deck build archetype released in the past 5 or so years. And an unfinished Modern archetype working in Genesys reflects the lower power level. It's once the support comes that the points should start applying to the decks. The problem is absolutism. From every other design avenue, it's fairly apparent that philosophies can't apply unilaterally for an overall positive effect on the game's environment. Some decks should be pointed on release, but I really don't think every single new archetype that isn't seeing competitive success in Constructed Modern needs to be pointed out of play. The fact they're being so forward about tweaking numbers as needed should be enough. What I find egregious is that some older decks are needlessly pointed in comparison. All of the Dragon Rulers don't really deserve to be 7 points apiece. You could put some, if not all of them, to 3 points to give them a little more wiggle room, and they wouldn't suddenly become broken. Despite that, they're a deck that's decently playable, but there are other old decks, ones that don't even have recent Modern support and have it far worse. Why is Zodiac pointed the way it is? Tenki is currently pointed high. In conjunction with Barrage, there's a major hit to its consistency. Then Ratpier, Broadbull, and Dryden are still all pointed high as well. Broadbull I can understand, since it's a generic searcher on a rank 4, but if we're preventing Barrage from being splashed, I really don't see a reason to be this harsh on the rest of the deck. Like with Habakiri and Prayers, limiting how generically abusable engines are is fine. It's a good way to separate Genesys from Modern. I really don't think spending a normal to make a Trident or 2 to 3 slots for 2 pops on a generic rank 4 is insane even for the standards of Genesys. I tried playing them under the notion that Ratpier was 10 points, and while it was crazy if I saw Ratpier, they do absolutely nothing unless they see Ratpier. Tri-Brigade is gone, so there's not much the deck even does. Points should be used to keep the cards from being abused generically, not keep the cards from being played in the first place. I think the deck needs an adjustment in how the points are distributed since it's a deck that's almost a decade old now. I can feel my bones turning to dust. But this current seemingly over-restriction might have something to do with their supposed internal testing for the format. When the format was first introduced, people noticed archetypes like Glad Beast, Ninja, Dragon Maid, Sword Soul, and many others seemingly disproportionately pointed for their actual performance in the format. They mentioned they had been testing the format for pretty long, so it's entirely possible they released the format balancing around outdated data and didn't realize that fact. Sword Soul being one of the more egregious examples. This may be a hot take, but Tenyi kind of carries Sword Soul. Both archetypes are too small to work well on their own, with Sword Soul depending on you always having a worm in hand and doing little else past the normal summon. They come together perfectly because Sword Soul is the muscle and Tenyi is the brains. But Tenyi requires its links to function, leaving Sword Soul and Genesys as figuratively brainless. So I don't see why they were so harshly pointed, especially when both Barone and Protoss, the actual problem cards, are already strictly pointed. Some of these restrictions have loosened up over time. Glad Beast's clear problematic elements being pointed rather than the deck itself, and Ninja basically being freed. But the only real concern is that this seems to be too reserved as an approach, when these sorts of tweaks could better help to flesh out the format, both to provide new experimentation with older cards, as well as more ways to tweak the gameplay's environment. This isn't the only type of concern with points being misplaced. There are quite a few cards that are harshly pointed, seemingly without understanding how they function in the format. The biggest standout to me being Level Eater. Why in God's name is it 100 points? The literal problem with this card was the existence of links. You removed them. This card does absolutely nothing now. You can't infinitely synchro with it because it isn't a tuner, and it eats the levels of level 5 or higher monsters. It was designed with restrictions in that context, so you literally can't climb without far more effort. Even if you're afraid of cards that enable FTK loops, this card's 100 points for an amazing reason. Similarly, Block Dragon doesn't necessarily need to be pointed so high in a format with no links. While it's far more lenient in comparison, I really don't think 33 is deserved either. The reason the non-once per turn was so broken was because you could just keep linking it off and do it repeatedly. It took zero effort to abuse. Without links, you actually have to work for it to generate tons of value, and that was the most frustrating thing about it in the main game. Hell, Magnet Warriors just got support, and I don't even think Block Dragon would be that impactful in helping them. Sure, it has use, but I don't know that they'd care that much for it. The worst thing it can do is search the barrier statue. They knew this, so the points conflict with each other. But I have to ask, why is it a 70-33 split and not just a 110 split? There's no reason to have the statues at 70 over 100 when it's evident they provide gameplay they don't want present in the first place. It feels like there are cards like these that have just been overlooked in how they function without links. To an extent, even Snow also fits under this category, especially since tier limits in every mill card is also harshly pointed right now. The only cards that feel like they were rightfully freed up are all the token generators. Dandelion is free, and it's not really seeing any play. There needs to be more valuation on these sorts of cards that become far less egregious when links are removed from the equation. This feeds into the Crimson Quandary, because we have to ask, why are they pointed the way that they are? And if they actually should be. Ideally, I want to see new decks potentially make unique use of these cards. They made Mirage of Nightmare free in the format, the exact sort of thing I wanted to see, but after some time theorying around it, I was underwhelmed. There really weren't that many interesting applications, just like with Metamorphosis. But worst of all, the problem people immediately fixated on. Its best use is with Radiant Typhoon, since they search MST to easily profit off of it. The deck was already dominant in the metagame, so this step in the right direction was viewed more cynically as buffing the already strongest deck in the format. Instant Fusion is currently 100 points, and I don't think it has any right to be. All of the most problematic Instant Fusion targets are already pointed harshly, because most of them are gameplay problems regardless if they're being summoned by Instant Fusion. So why is it even at 100? God forbid you summon Master of Ham. But the thing is, if they loosened up on it in the near future, it'd be seen from the same cynical view, because the Fairy Tail fusions are coming out in the near future. So Instant Fusion actually does become a problem in making the engine easily accessible without harsher points on both it and them. The point is, there doesn't seem to be enough of a genuine effort to push these cards in a unique direction with the format. And even when they do, it doesn't feel all too genuine. They need to be more attentive to these things so we can avoid viewing changes like these as being purely calculated to push modern product. The Branded incident was a decent handling of this issue. Almost every fusion was pointed to stop you from splashing it as an engine with the new Fallen Virtuous spell, but this basically made it so Branded itself couldn't work. They went back on that direction and made the deck playable and just priced out the spell from being a generic staple. With Branded Fusion, their most contentious card, out of the picture because of its steep price, the deck is far less bothersome. Even with its new support, it feels as though it's not just being used as a vehicle to buy the new cards. On the other hand, they could also embrace Genesys with modern products, but doing so in a unique way. We do see world premiere cards released throughout certain products in the TCG, and while I don't want to see new archetypes that are good in Genesys but not modern, I think the free agent cards are a great way to support Genesys. Designing cards like Boyo, Mutiny, and Luce that support an archetype that clearly hasn't been supported directly in a while. But instead of support for the sake of it, it could be supporting decks that need links or pendulums to function. In essence, giving these decks a way to be more playable in Genesys. Designing cards specifically to fill in the gaps of these archetypes within Genesys. The last thing they need to pay more attention to with Genesys is the free staples. Figure out more healthy free staples for the format. Final Bringer of the End Times is one of the premier free staples of the format. This is a great piece of removal for a lower power format. But other than that, the quality is more sparse. There's DD Crow and Skullmeister for free hand traps, and further removal like Ultimate Slayer and Subversion, but it still feels a little underdeveloped. list. Originally there was a Rescue Ace package being played as a staple in most decks, then they were pointed. It was just a generic draw engine, the type of thing that shouldn't be free because it's just going to be put in every deck, but it feels like there aren't any other meaningful freebies in the format's card pool, and that's sort of a problem. The clear philosophy in the existing 0-point staples are that these cards are more niche in design. They aren't universally applicable, and most importantly, their design isn't oppressive. This is the aspect of the game that needs to be cultivated for the cards caught in the Crimson Quandary to be playable. Finding these powerful cards that make these decks still playable, but don't shatter the game's balance by being free. Book of Moon is currently 7 points, and I'm not sure why it isn't a 0-point staple. Forbidden Crown, an infinitely more powerful piece of disruption, is only 3 points more than it. I'm aware this also serves to make it so you can't play multiple powerful disruption spells like both of them, but Book certainly isn't that concerning. Was the thought process that the removal of links makes Book too good? It could certainly be cheaper if not 0 regardless. I'd like to see more cards evaluated as being cheap staples if not free. The point I want to make though is they need to find more ways to better achieve this goal with other values in the point system. These are all aching pains of gameplay that I hope to see addressed. They're the most important things to assess within the format, but I want to close this video out highlighting the external and tangential issues that end up bleeding in to cause even more problems. One of the big things that people mention is the fact that there's no official digital support for play, making it so the primary way to play is in person at events or locals. I'm not going to make the claim that Master Duel is killing the TCG, because that would be stupid. However, the lack of versatility in how you can engage with the format naturally hampers how many people can access the game. I don't think we can just implement it in Master Duel because it's a TCG format, and we can't just make an official digital sim for it specifically. That's not remotely realistic, but that market would be really great for initial growth, and since we're trying to grow it, that's sort of a problem. By all means, they could eventually implement it in a Master Duel, but they could have also implemented a Goat ladder, Edison ladder, Hat ladder, Clownblade ladder, Toss ladder, Team Battle ladder, Tag Duels to flesh out the team aspect of the game, a casual mode that's actually casual, a draft mode, 50 more solo modes, more customization for duel rooms, specifically special rules from events like the Duel Trials, the ability to do custom dice rally events in duel rooms, and literally any other game mode in existence. But they haven't. So I don't think they're going to add Genesys of all things if they can't be bothered to do anything else in the first place. What they can and should really be working on is with how you engage with the format in general, because currently, the official way to track and engage with the format is abysmal. This is one of the more frustrating things that seems to fly under people's radar when it comes to talking about Genesys. There is an official way to track and build for Genesys on Konami's site. The problem is, it sucks. When I asked people if they used the site, not only did few say they did, a majority of people didn't even know it existed, and it shows. Honestly, Konami's site for Yu-Gi-Oh! As a whole is a rabbit hole in and of itself, so let's just limit it to relevance towards Genesys. When viewing it, you can't find a tab that takes you to Genesys. There's an alternate format section, and Genesys isn't even there. The only way to get to Genesys on their site is a visual tab. It's the 4th one. These are mostly used to promote products. Why is an entire format hidden here? If you're going to get to the site, you're just going to search for Genesys in general, which means you're already aware of it. When you do access it, things don't get much better though. You're given the rules, 2 links, and the point list. The first link is to blog posts about the format, and the second is a link to the main tool to calculate deck building for the format. This tool is the most important thing for the format, and it's an utter headache. If I had to guess, it's likely built on the same infrastructure as the main card database to save time, which makes its visual presentation very flat and bland. Worst of all, it fails to accommodate the format's unique characteristics. The point value of cards are barely visible when searching. Something that should be front and center when looking for cards is presented like a simple footnote yes-no value, making the defining characteristic of the format seem innocuous on the site dedicated to it. To make matters worse, if you click on a card to view it directly, the page doesn't provide info about the point value of the card, and unlike the card database website, it doesn't suggest related cards, something that would help immensely in this tool that's meant for deck building. If you decide you want to make a deck after spotting a card in search, you can't just click on it and make the deck going from there. You click on the card, which takes you to the dedicated page, which as stated, doesn't provide relevant information. Then you need to click Add to Deck List, which means you have to make a deck list beforehand, because you can only add them to existing ones. Doing so means leaving the page, making this entire process inconvenient and disruptive. You have the ability to add cards while viewing the deck list, but the presentation is visually sterile. Just like the general search, there's no emphasis on information, nor a clean visual presentation. It's all presented the same way, and plainly so. The important details don't stand out. Your eyes are forced to scan for that information anytime you need reference.
Ironically, when I went to record this, they added this in. The search function still doesn't work, but hey, this is progress.
On top of the presentation being unclear, it's utterly lifeless, making it feel like I'm just filing my taxes instead of building a list for a fun game. It's tedious to interact with and a visual chore. Attempting to build lists from the search function isn't any better. There's no visual for your list at the side of the screen to track what you've already added to it, so if you're going around and hunting cards, you need to, at all times, note what you've already put in the list, defeating the entire purpose of using the site to begin with, making this method of deck building the objective wrong way to do so, which would be fine if the objective correct way to do so wasn't also miserable. And if you're using the function to just literally search for cards, you're going to be even more frustrated. The filtering system is obtuse and doesn't even work in some cases. I tried to filter by XYZ at one point, then when I clicked search, no results. If you try to filter by excluding cards, it doesn't work either. I decided to search XYZ by excluding everything but XYZ. Then I realized you can't exclude spells or traps, and even sorting through the near 50 pages of spell traps, the only XYZ I saw were Gem Knight Pearl and Gaga Gigo on page 45 and 6. And if you select to not filter out effect monsters, you get main deck effect monsters. There is no way to filter XYZ currently. Wonderful. There's a way to search by specific point values, but there's no way to just filter to cards that are pointed in general. If you want to do that, you have to manually click 45 times to select every point value, or click card list, which you then can't filter to make searching easy. It's not even like most point values serve a unique defined role that other ones don't. There's no real need to have a specific filter for each one. They'd be better off applying filters to the card list function, making it easier to search out pointed cards, searching price ranges rather than every single unique value. Another nuisance is that it's extremely common in Yu-Gi-Oh! To have cards that aren't in archetype by name, but functionally are. And since there's no related cards function, and no search by mentioned in text, the search function just doesn't accommodate searching anything well. If you want to search for cards that mention tokens or some other mechanic, you can't. There are just absolutely no convenient measures in the search function of this site. When I would search by other existing options, I would get results with no visible cards, but multiple pages to cycle through, with one card every other odd page. The site barely works, and that's a problem. This may seem petty, but quality user interface is extremely important when it comes to these types of systems. This is the intended primary way to engage and interact with the format. If the design creates too much friction in basic use, people will just get fed up with it, potentially using other means that are far less egregious. Or worse of all, just not bothering with the format if this is the intended way to engage with it. I cannot state enough just how important a good user interface is. Having a clear visual presentation that provides all relevant info is very important. Structuring that's aesthetically pleasing is also important. That's what's needed of this site. Building for the game shouldn't feel like a chore, it should feel like an engaging experience, since that's the core selling point of the format, and finagling with this poor system actively gets in the way of that. When it comes to playing Genesys, since it's only in person, product itself is another problem with the format. The design of gameplay isn't the only other unfortunate trickle down in Genesys. It's also the economics. While we've been receiving better quality products unique to the TCG, the structure of main set products is still awful and egregiously predatory, making the products undesirable and the contents inaccessible. This naturally ripples into Genesys. This is most evident with the deck build packs. Vanquish Soul released with nearly every name at UR. The deck was prohibitively expensive despite not being remotely close to a competitive powerhouse. Sue and Start were 2 years off. Despite that lull in the deck's viability, the deck wasn't cheap for most of its life, despite fading out of play. This is an example from 3 years ago. This is still the norm. with Cool Tune being the latest example. When they release new decks that don't see immediate competitive success, they're still expensive because of the product structure, owing to both the supply because of the limitations provided by the high rarity distribution and speculative worth. And if those cards are pretty competent in Genesys, that worth is no longer speculative. Because these decks are subject to the awful structure of existing product, that means there's more demand for that little supply, meaning these cards that are already needlessly expensive inconvenience even more people, because you're effectively getting priced out of the premier alternative format as well as the main one. They could design products specifically for Genesys, but that's a financial risk that ultimately shouldn't be necessary. This should serve as a final wake-up call in changing the structure of products. If more people want to play the game with this new format that includes modern cards, more people are going to want product. Those cards should be much more broadly available, not predatorily seeded to the highest rarity slots exclusively to make them super expensive to build. We're getting extended arts and products going forward. Those as a rarity should be doing the heavy lifting on the gambling-oriented purchases of product, not the core game pieces required to play the game. And lastly, the biggest sore spot for why people hate Genesys is what happened to Ultimate Time Wizard. Genesys seemingly cannibalized Time Wizard, at least in America specifically, for some reason. With people reaching the cynical conclusion it was cut because legacy formats don't move new product, so they were cut in favor of a format that does. Just ignore the other alternative formats that do that and were still forgotten by Konami. This is no reason to hate the format itself. At the end of the day, it's Konami's decision to discontinue Time Wizard, and it was clearly only a decision in America. Hating the format for this reason is purely petty, and doesn't direct criticism where it actually should be. Personally, I didn't really care for Time Wizard either. Might be shocking to hear, but people actually want to play with newer cards. Maybe there's an archetype that never hit its stride because of general game balance at the time. So even if you played it in Time Wizard, you'd just be reminded why it wasn't played to begin with. People do want to play these sorts of decks with more modern support, and the main game, unfortunately, isn't kind to that notion a lot of the time. The problem is there never really was a good format for that, and Genesys says it wants to be that, but they actually need to make that the case still. It's fine existing as its own thing. Every now and then I'll enjoy a game of legacy formats, but ultimately they don't provide the same high that more modern gameplay does, which is my biggest problem with Time Wizard conceptually. It only ever really gravitated towards Goat and Edison. If you wanted to play anything even remotely evocative of modern gameplay, too damn bad, I guess. Maybe a version of Hat format, but any other format, good luck finding any takers. It feels like Time Wizard was purely a boomer format, so its gameplay divide was just massive. Arc 5 era Yu-Gi-Oh! Was 12 years ago. Brains was 9 years ago. No sign of those in Time Wizard, and even if it's to avoid the playmat discrepancies, Pote was 4 years ago. A format people talked up, and that also gets nothing. Time Wizard catered to only the big two, which in turn limited the growth of the format as Time Wizard, which is what frustrates me. Genesys and Time Wizard could perfectly cohabitate the Yu-Gi-Oh! Space, even provide a symbiotic relationship, playing decks in their heyday of a Time Wizard format, then being able to tweak it with modern cards to use it in Genesys, propping old decks from that era up in Genesys as a way to encourage Time Wizard players to engage with modern gameplay, and modern players to try dialing it back to the past from time to time. There's never really a direct incentive for Time Wizard players to buy new product, and there still isn't. But if the two were actually framed this way, it very easily could have done that. It also makes a better on-ramp for Yu-Gi-Oh!, letting players experience older and slower gameplay, and giving them a clear transition point that doesn't toss them into the deep end. I don't hate Genesys, and I really don't think people should either. Regardless of the Time Wizard drama or it being modern light, the format is a clear sign that Konami's doing more for design balance and communication. It's the only format they actually seem willing to push. So I should hope that it isn't punished, so they actually start expanding on other formats with its success. Their open and frequent communication is great and reassuring, so I should hope that it does well off of that alone, because it's what we need most at this point. They've used the blog post to do a deck spotlight. Granted, it was only Blue Eyes. I think they should do more with that in general, highlighting decks that achieve Genesys' core gameplay goals and encourage players to further explore them. Of course, I'd recommend they better direct people to the site, at least once it's actually polished, because I think the format's worth keeping an eye on even if it may seem underwhelming currently. There is just one last thing to say about Genesys though, to the Konami employee that needs to hear this. Cutting off the graveyard is a floodgate. I don't know how you can so concretely identify every other floodgate as a problem, then play coy with every single graveyard banishing floodgate. In the game where 99% of decks have revolved around the graveyard in some way for the last decade and a half. This was your doing, wasn't it? I'll find you, and I'll send you to the graveyard. No targeting protection in the world will save you.